Charleston, South Carolina, March 17th, 1859. 2:47 in the afternoon. The auction block stood in the center of Ryan's slave market like an altar to human cruelty, its wooden surface stained dark by rain, sweat, and the weight of 1,000 broken lives. The air was thick with humidity and tobacco smoke, the crowd of plantation owners restless, their eyes cold and calculating as livestock passed before them. And then she was brought forward, the last woman of the day. Chains clinked softly around her wrists, but her head was not bowed. Her eyes, dark and unblinking, swept across the crowd like a blade. The auctioneer's voice cracked the silence. "Final lot of the day, gentlemen. Strong, young, fertile." But no one moved. No one raised a hand. The silence that followed was not one of disinterest. It was fear. Her name was Asha, though no one on that block knew it. To them, she was nameless property, yet something about her presence made men shift their weight and look away. Rumors had traveled faster than any bill of sale. Whispers from the last plantation she'd been sold from, then the one before that, and the one before that. 7 owners in 3 years, each one eager to be rid of her. They said she didn't speak, but when she did, men died. They said she had the mark of something unholy, a curse, some called it. A reckoning, others whispered in darker tones. She had buried 3 overseers, all of whom had tried to break her. The circumstances were always different: a fall from a horse, a fever that came without warning, a rope that snapped at just the wrong moment. Coincidence, the law said. Witchcraft, the slaves murmured. And so she stood there, unsold, unwanted, yet impossible to ignore. But one man did not look away. His name was Nathaniel Kane, owner of Blackthorn Plantation, a sprawling empire of cotton and cruelty 30 miles inland. He was not a superstitious man. He believed in control, in dominance, in the iron certainty that all things could be broken if you knew where to apply pressure. He saw the fear in the other men's eyes and mistook it for weakness. He saw her defiance and mistook it for a challenge. And so, when the auctioneer's gavel hovered in the air, ready to dismiss her back into the pens, Nathaniel Kane raised his hand. The room went silent. The transaction was made. The papers were signed. And as Asha was led toward his wagon, her eyes met his for the first time, and in that moment something ancient and patient smiled behind them. If you believe some souls are born not to be owned, but to settle debts written in blood and fire, then stay with this story. Watch what happens when a man who believes he can break anything meets a woman who has been breaking men long before he was born. The journey to Blackthorn Plantation took 4 hours by wagon, and Asha did not speak once. She sat in the back, chains still on her wrists, her body swaying with the rhythm of the rutted dirt road. Nathaniel Kane rode up front, occasionally glancing back at her through the canvas opening, studying her the way a man might study a wild horse he intended to break. The landscape around them shifted from the bustling port city to endless fields of cotton, stretching toward the horizon like a white ocean frozen mid-wave. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the land, and the air grew cooler, though it still carried the weight of coming spring. Nathaniel's driver, an older black man named Samuel, who had served the Kane family for 30 years, kept his eyes fixed on the road. He had heard the rumors too. Everyone had. But he said nothing because men like Samuel had learned long ago that survival meant silence. As the plantation gates came into view, tall iron bars twisted into the shape of thorns, a bitter joke Nathaniel's father had commissioned, Asha finally moved. She turned her head slowly, taking in the sight of Blackthorn. The main house stood 3 stories high, white-columned and pristine, a monument to wealth built on stolen lives. Behind it, rows of slave quarters lined the edges of the property, small wooden shacks with dirt floors and no windows. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, dinner being prepared after a long day in the fields, and beyond that, the fields themselves, endless, oppressive, beautiful in their horror. Nathaniel noticed her gaze and smiled. "You'll work the house," he said, his voice calm, assured. "You're too pretty to waste in the fields. My wife needs a new attendant. You'll serve her, keep quiet, and if you're smart, you'll last longer than the others." Asha's eyes shifted to him. For the first time she spoke. Her voice was low, steady, and carried the cadence of something far older than her years. "I don't serve the living," she said. "I bury the dead." Nathaniel's smile faltered. Samuel's hands tightened on the reins. The wagon rolled through the gates, the sun dipped below the horizon, and Blackthorn Plantation welcomed its last slave. The house smelled of lavender and lies. That was Asha's first thought as she was led through the grand entrance by the head housemaid, a stern woman named Prudence whose face had been carved by years of silent compliance. The floors were polished marble, cool beneath Asha's bare feet, and the walls were adorned with paintings of Cain ancestors, men with hard eyes and women with painted smiles, all of them watching. Gas lamps flickered in their sconces, casting golden light across mahogany furniture and velvet drapes. Everything was pristine, everything was ordered. It was the kind of beauty that required suffering to maintain. Prudence moved quickly through the corridors, her keys jangling at her waist, and Asha followed without resistance. They passed the dining room where a long table sat beneath a crystal chandelier, set for a meal that would feed 2 people while 50 others ate scraps in the quarters outside. They passed the parlor where Nathaniel's wife, Catherine, sat with embroidery in her lap, her blonde hair pinned perfectly, her posture straight as a church pew. She glanced up as they walked by, her pale blue eyes settling on Asha with the casual cruelty of someone who had never questioned her place in the world. She did not smile. She did not frown. She simply looked, assessed, and returned to her needlework. Prudence led Asha up the servants' staircase, narrow, hidden, designed so that the enslaved could move through the house like ghosts, and stopped at a small room on the 3rd floor. It was barely larger than a closet. A thin mattress lay on the floor. A single candle sat on a wooden crate. No window, no air. "You sleep here," Prudence said. "You wake at 4. You dress Mrs. Cain, prepare her breakfast, attend her throughout the day, and you do not speak unless spoken to. You do not look the master in the eye. You do not touch anything that isn't yours. You do not exist unless we need you to exist." She paused, her expression softening for just a moment, a flicker of something human beneath the mask. "And if you're smart, girl, you'll forget whatever it is you think you are. That pride of yours, it'll get you killed." Asha stepped into the room. She turned slowly, meeting Prudence's gaze. "I've died before," she said quietly. "It didn't take." The first week passed in silence. Asha performed her duties with mechanical precision, dressing Catherine Cain in corsets and petticoats, brushing her hair until it shone like spun gold, serving tea in porcelain cups so delicate they seemed to tremble in her hands. She moved through the house like a shadow, present but unseen, and Catherine treated her the way one might treat a piece of furniture, useful, unremarkable, easily replaced. But the other slaves noticed. In the quarters at night, when the field hands returned with bent backs and bloodied hands, they would gather around small fires and speak in hushed tones about the new woman in the big house. Old Martha, who had been at Blackthorn longer than anyone could remember, warned them to stay away from her. "That one got death in her eyes," she said, stirring a pot of watery stew. "I seen it before. She ain't here to survive. She here to settle something." The younger ones laughed nervously, dismissing her words as superstition, but they kept their distance all the same. Even Samuel, who drove the wagon and had seen more than most, would not meet Asha's gaze when their paths crossed. He had heard what she said that first night. "I don't serve the living, I bury the dead," and those words had burrowed into him like a splinter he couldn't remove. Meanwhile, Nathaniel Cain watched. He was a man who prided himself on control, on reading people the way a card sharp reads a deck, and Asha intrigued him in a way that bordered on obsession. She did not flinch when he entered a room. She did not lower her eyes. She did not tremble, and that defiance, subtle as it was, gnawed at him. One evening, as Asha stood silently behind Catherine during dinner, Nathaniel set down his wine glass and spoke directly to her for the first time since her arrival. "You have a name?" he asked. Catherine glanced up, surprised. Slaves were not addressed at the table. Asha did not hesitate. "Asha." "Asha," Nathaniel repeated, tasting the word. "And where did you come from, Asha? Before the auction?" Her eyes met his, steady, unflinching. "From the same place you're going," she said. The room went cold. Catherine's fork clattered against her plate. Nathaniel's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the table. But he did not look away, and neither did she. That night, Nathaniel Kane could not sleep. He lay beside his wife in their grand four-poster bed, the curtains drawn, the room thick with darkness, but his mind would not rest. Catherine slept soundly, her breathing soft and rhythmic, unbothered by the strange tension that had filled the dining room hours earlier. But Nathaniel stared at the ceiling, replaying Asha's words over and over. "From the same place you're going." It was not the defiance that unsettled him. He had broken defiant slaves before. It was the certainty in her voice, the way she had spoken not as a threat but as a simple statement of fact, the way one might comment on the weather or the position of the sun. He rose from the bed, careful not to wake Catherine, and pulled on his robe. The house was silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the distant creak of old wood settling. He moved through the darkness with practiced ease, descending the main staircase, past the portraits of his ancestors, their painted eyes following him as he went. He told himself he was simply restless, that a glass of brandy in his study would settle his nerves, but his feet carried him elsewhere. To the servants' staircase, to the third floor, to the small, narrow room where Asha slept. The door was ajar. He pushed it open slowly, the hinges whispering, and stepped inside. The candle had burned down to a stub, its weak light casting flickering shadows across the walls. Asha sat on the thin mattress, cross-legged, her back straight, her eyes open. She was not asleep. She had been waiting. "You came," she said softly, as if she had known he would. Nathaniel's hand tightened on the doorframe. "You will not speak to me that way again," he said, his voice low, controlled. "Not at my table, not in my house. Do you understand?" Asha tilted her head slightly, studying him the way one might study an insect caught in a web. "You don't own me," she said. "You bought my body, but my body is just a house, Mr. Kane. And the thing that lives inside it?" She smiled then, a small, cold smile that did not reach her eyes. "That thing has been waiting for you for a very long time." Nathaniel Kane prided himself on being a rational man, a man of science and progress, a man who dismissed the superstitions of the uneducated masses as the desperate fantasies of inferior minds. He had built his fortune on calculated risk, on understanding the mechanics of labor and leverage, on knowing that fear was a tool and power was a mathematics. And yet, standing in that cramped servants' room with Asha's words hanging in the air between them like smoke, he felt something he had not felt since childhood, the primal animal instinct that warns a creature it has wandered into the wrong territory. He wanted to strike her. His hand even twitched toward her, muscle memory from years of enforcing his will through violence, but he stopped, not out of mercy, not out of conscience, but because something in her stillness, in the quiet patience of her posture, suggested that she wanted him to, that she was waiting for it, that the moment his hand touched her, something would shift irreversibly, and the game he thought he was playing would reveal itself to be something else entirely. Instead, he straightened, pulling his robe tighter around himself, reclaiming the mask of authority that had slipped for just a moment. "You will learn your place," he said, his voice cold and measured, "or you will learn what happens to those who forget it." He turned and left, closing the door behind him with deliberate control, refusing to slam it, refusing to give her the satisfaction of knowing she had unsettled him. But as he descended the stairs, his heart was pounding in his chest like a drum, and his hands were trembling. Behind the closed door, Asha remained seated, her expression unchanged. She reached beneath the thin mattress and pulled out a small cloth bundle she had hidden there on her first night. Inside were three things: a lock of hair, gray and brittle, taken from the first overseer who had tried to break her; a broken pocket watch stopped at 3:33 taken from the second; and a single tooth, still stained with blood, taken from the third. She added nothing to the collection tonight. It was too soon. But she knew, with the certainty of someone who had walked this path before, that soon there would be four. The days that followed were marked by a tension that spread through Blackthorn Plantation like a fever. Nathaniel Kane became irritable, snapping at his overseers, drinking more than usual, losing himself in ledgers and paperwork as if numbers could restore the order he felt slipping from his grasp. Catherine noticed the change in her husband but attributed it to business concerns, perhaps a bad crop yield, perhaps debt, perhaps the political tensions brewing between North and South. She did not suspect the truth, that her husband was being haunted by a slave girl who barely spoke and never looked away. In the fields, the work continued as it always had. Men and women bent under the weight of cotton sacks, their hands bleeding from the sharp bowls, their backs aching under the relentless sun. The overseer, a cruel man named Emmett Boone, rode among them on horseback, his whip coiled at his side like a sleeping serpent. Boone was Nathaniel's enforcer, the instrument through which control was maintained. He was a large man, thick-necked and broad-shouldered, with a face that seemed incapable of expressing anything other than contempt. He had been beating slaves since he was 16 years old, and he was good at it, knew exactly how much pain to inflict without damaging the property too severely, knew how to make examples that would keep the others in line. He had heard about Asha, of course. Everyone had. And he had laughed at the stories, dismissed them as the foolish superstitions of ignorant field hands. But when he saw her one morning, walking from the main house to the well to draw water for Catherine's bath, something about her stopped him cold. She moved with a strange, deliberate grace, as if every step was measured, as if she were walking not on dirt but on the bones of men who had underestimated her. Boone urged his horse forward, blocking her path. "You the one they say is cursed?" he asked, his voice mocking. Asha stopped. She did not look up at him. She simply stood there, bucket in hand, waiting. "I asked you a question, girl," Boone said, his tone hardening. Slowly, Asha raised her head. Her eyes met his. And in that moment, Emmett Boone felt something he had never felt before in his life. He felt small. Emmett Boone was not a man who frightened easily. He had killed before, 3 men in bar fights, 1 runaway slave who had tried to fight back, and countless animals he had tortured as a boy simply to watch them suffer. Violence was his language, and he spoke it fluently. But standing there, looking down at Asha from his horse, he felt a coldness creep into his chest that had nothing to do with the morning air. Her eyes were not defiant. They were not angry. They were simply knowing. As if she could see past his flesh, past his cruelty, past the armor of brutality he had spent his entire life constructing, and into the hollow, cowardly thing that lived at his core. "I don't believe in curses," he said, though his voice had lost some of its edge. Asha tilted her head slightly. "You will," she said. Then she stepped around his horse and continued toward the well, leaving him sitting there, his whip hand trembling slightly, his mouth dry. He told himself it was nothing, that she was just a woman, just property, just another body to be controlled. But that night, when he returned to his small cabin at the edge of the plantation, he could not shake the feeling that something had followed him home. He lit a lantern and poured himself a whiskey, drinking it quickly, then pouring another. The cabin was sparse: a bed, a table, a chair, a rifle mounted on the wall. He had never needed much. Comfort was for weak men. He sat at the table, trying to review the next day's work orders, but his mind kept drifting back to her eyes, to the way she had looked at him, to the certainty in her voice. "You will." He drank until the bottle was half empty, then stumbled to his bed and collapsed onto it, still fully clothed. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it brought dreams, dark dreams, dreams of drowning in cotton fields, of being buried alive beneath endless white balls, of hands reaching up from the earth to pull him down. And in every dream, she was there, standing at the edge of his vision, watching, waiting. When Emmett Boone woke the next morning, his pillow was soaked with sweat, and coiled on his chest, perfectly still, was a copperhead snake. The scream that tore from Emmett Boone's throat was heard across the plantation. He thrashed violently, flinging himself from the bed, the snake hissing as it fell to the floor and slithered quickly toward the corner of the cabin. Boone scrambled backward, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst through his ribs. He grabbed his rifle from the wall and fired 3 times, the shots deafening in the small space, splintering the floorboards but missing the snake entirely. It disappeared through a gap in the wall, leaving only silence and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Boone stood there, chest heaving, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the rifle. He checked himself frantically for bite marks, running his hands over his arms, his chest, his neck. Nothing. The snake had not struck. It had simply been there, resting on him, as if it had been placed. His mind raced. Snakes sometimes found their way into cabins. It was the South, it was spring, it happened. But not like this. Not coiled perfectly on a man's chest while he slept. Not without biting, not without reason. He thought of Asha, of her eyes, of her words. You will. By the time the sun had fully risen, word of Boone's encounter had spread through the quarters like wildfire. The field hands whispered as they worked, stealing glances toward the main house where Asha continued her duties as if nothing had happened. Old Martha shook her head knowingly, her wrinkled hands shelling peas with practiced efficiency. "Told you," she muttered to the others gathered around her. "That girl ain't natural. She got the old ways in her. My grandmother had it too, could call things from the earth, make men see their own deaths before they came. You don't fight people like that. You just stay out their way and pray you ain't the one they came for." Samuel, sitting nearby and mending a harness, said nothing, but his face was troubled. He had seen enough in his years at Blackthorn to know that some things could not be explained by reason, that there were forces in the world older and darker than any law or gospel. And he wondered, not for the first time, what Nathaniel Kane had brought into his house. Nathaniel Kane heard about the snake incident by mid-morning, delivered to him by a nervous field hand who had been sent to fetch the doctor. Boone was refusing to leave his cabin, convinced that something unnatural was at work, demanding that the slave girl be removed from the plantation immediately. Nathaniel dismissed the man with a wave of his hand and sat alone in his study, staring at the amber liquid in his glass. He was a man who had always believed in cause and effect, in the rational order of things. Snakes entered cabins, men had nightmares, coincidences occurred. But the timing unsettled him. 3 days after Asha had spoken those words to him in her room, his most trusted enforcer was unraveling. He could remove her, of course, sell her at a loss, send her back to Charleston, have her disappear into the fields of some distant plantation where she would become someone else's problem. It would be the practical choice, the safe choice. But Nathaniel Kane had not built his empire by backing down from challenges, and something in him, pride, stubbornness, or perhaps a darker curiosity, refused to let this woman defeat him. He would break her. He would prove that she was nothing more than flesh and bone, that her defiance was merely theatrics, that the fear she inspired in ignorant minds was simply the superstition of the weak. He drained his glass and stood, straightening his coat, composing himself. He would go to her now, in the daylight, in his house, surrounded by his power and his wealth, and he would remind her, and himself, who was master here. He found her in Catherine's chambers, folding linens with slow, deliberate care. Catherine had gone to visit a neighbor, leaving the house unusually quiet. Asha did not look up when he entered, did not acknowledge his presence, simply continued her work as if he were invisible. "Look at me," Nathaniel commanded. She finished folding the linen in her hands, placed it carefully on the bed, and only then turned to face him. Her expression was neutral, patient, maddeningly calm. "You think you can frighten me?" he asked, stepping closer. "You think your tricks and your silence make you powerful?" Asha regarded him for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice soft but clear. "I don't need to frighten you, Mr. Kane. You're already afraid. You just don't know what of yet." Nathaniel's hand shot out before he could stop himself, striking Asha across the face with enough force to snap her head to the side. The sound echoed through the empty room like a thunderclap. She stumbled but did not fall, and when she straightened, there was blood at the corner of her mouth. For a moment they stood frozen, predator and prey, though which was which had become unclear. Nathaniel's chest heaved with anger and something else, something he could not name. He had hit slaves before, countless times, and it had always been simple, an assertion of power, a correction, a reminder of the natural order. But this felt different. This felt like he had just made a terrible mistake. Asha wiped the blood from her lip with the back of her hand, her eyes never leaving his. She did not cry out. She did not cower. She simply looked at him with that same unbearable patience, as if she had been expecting this, as if every action he took was simply another step along a path that had been laid out long before he was born. "That's 3, she said quietly. Nathaniel's blood went cold. "What?" "3 men who struck me," Asha continued, her voice steady despite the blood. "The first was an overseer named Thomas Grimm. He hit me because I wouldn't lie with him. 2 weeks later, his horse threw him. He broke his neck on a fence post. The second was a plantation owner named Richard Howlett. He hit me because I looked at his wife. 1 month later, he developed a fever. The doctors couldn't explain it. He died screaming, seeing things that weren't there. The third was a man named Samuel Cutler, not your Samuel, another one. He hit me because I smiled at the wrong time. He's the one who gave me this." She touched her lip where the blood had been. 3 days later, someone found him hanging in his barn. They said it was suicide. She stepped closer to Nathaniel, close enough that he could see his own reflection in her dark eyes. "You're the 4th, she whispered, "and 4 is a powerful number." Nathaniel Kane wanted to laugh. He wanted to dismiss her words as the desperate performance of a slave trying to manipulate him through fear. He wanted to strike her again, to assert his dominance, to prove that he was not some superstitious fool who could be cowed by ghost stories and veiled threats. But he could not move. His feet felt rooted to the floor, his limbs heavy, as though the air itself had thickened around him. Asha's gaze held him like iron chains, and for the first time in his life, Nathaniel Kane understood what it meant to be property, to be something owned, controlled, rendered powerless by a force greater than yourself. "You're insane," he managed, his voice hoarse. "You're just a slave. You're nothing." "I was nothing," Asha agreed, her tone almost gentle now, like a mother explaining something to a child. "I was a girl once. I had a name my mother gave me, a village where I belonged, a future that should have been mine. Then men like you came. They burned my home. They killed my father in front of me. They chained my mother and my sisters and put us on a ship where half of us died in the dark. And when we arrived in this place you call a nation, they sold us like cattle." Her voice never rose, never broke, but each word landed with the weight of stone. "I died on that ship, Mr. Kane. The girl I was drowned in her own vomit and terror somewhere in the middle of the ocean. What survived, what walks around in this body is something else, something older. My grandmother had it, her grandmother before her. It lives in the blood of women who refuse to be broken. It waits, it watches, and when the time comes, it settles accounts." She turned away from him then, returning to the linens as if the conversation had ended, as if he no longer mattered. "You should prepare yourself," she said without looking back. "Death doesn't come all at once for men like you. It comes in pieces. A sleepless night, a shadow at the corner of your eye, a feeling that something is wrong even when everything appears right, and then when you're hollowed out and exhausted, When you've lost the will to fight, that's when it takes you. Listen closely now, because this is where the story turns. This is where you must decide whether you believe that justice can wear the face of vengeance, whether you think some debts are so deep they transcend the grave, whether you understand that history is not just what is written in books, but what is carried in the blood of the survivors. Nathaniel Kane walked out of that room a changed man, though he did not yet know how completely he had been altered. The clock had begun its countdown. The pieces were moving into place, and Asha, who had been sold 7 times, who had buried 3 men, who carried the weight of her ancestors in every breath, she was finally exactly where she needed to be. If you want to see how a monster falls, if you need to witness what happens when the universe bends toward justice, then stay, subscribe, bear witness. Because what comes next will be remembered long after these words fade. That night, Nathaniel Kane could not eat. Catherine noticed, of course, her pale eyes flicking between her husband and the untouched plate of roasted quail and potatoes before him. The dining room was as it always was, candlelit, elegant, insulated from the suffering that funded its beauty. But Nathaniel felt as though he were sitting in a tomb. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his wine, and he drank deeply, trying to drown the unease that had taken root in his chest. "Are you unwell?" Catherine asked, her voice carrying that particular tone of wifely concern that was equal parts genuine worry and social obligation. "I'm fine," Nathaniel replied curtly, "just tired." But he was not fine. He could feel Asha's presence in the house even though she was upstairs, could sense her like a weight pressing down on the roof, could hear her words echoing in his mind with the persistence of a funeral bell. Death comes in pieces. He excused himself early, retreating to his study with a bottle of brandy and the ledgers he told himself he needed to review. But the numbers swam before his eyes, meaningless. He found himself listening to the sounds of the house, the creak of floorboards, the whisper of wind against windows, the distant murmur of slaves settling into their quarters for the night. Every sound felt like a threat. Around midnight, he heard footsteps above him, slow, deliberate, moving across the 3rd floor where Asha's room was located. He told himself it was nothing, that she was simply moving about, that slaves did not sleep soundly because their lives did not permit it. But the footsteps stopped directly above his head, and then, clear and distinct in the silence, he heard 3 knocks. Knock, knock, knock. Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the ceiling, his heart pounding. The knocks came again, same rhythm, same deliberate spacing. He wanted to call out, to demand who was there, but his voice had abandoned him. The knocking stopped. The house fell silent, and Nathaniel Kane sat alone in his study, staring at the ceiling, knowing with absolute certainty that something had begun that he could not stop. The days that followed became a waking nightmare. Nathaniel stopped sleeping more than an hour or 2 at a time, jolting awake at every sound, drenched in sweat, his mind conjuring horrors in every shadow. He began seeing things at the edges of his vision, figures that vanished when he turned to look, movements in mirrors that did not match his own, fleeting glimpses of faces he recognized but could not place. The faces of slaves who had died on his plantation over the years, he realized with growing dread. The old man who had collapsed in the fields from heat stroke. The young woman who had bled to death after a difficult childbirth with no doctor willing to come. The boy who had been whipped so severely he never recovered. They were all there, watching from doorways, standing at the foot of his bed, their eyes hollow and accusing. He tried to tell himself it was exhaustion, that lack of sleep was causing hallucinations, that his mind was playing tricks on him. But the rational explanations felt increasingly hollow. His health began to deteriorate. He lost weight, his skin taking on a grayish pallor, his eyes becoming sunken and bloodshot. Catherine grew alarmed and summoned the family doctor, a portly man named Dr. Whitmore, who examined Nathaniel thoroughly and found nothing physically wrong. Stress, the doctor concluded, prescribing rest and a tonic that tasted like rust and did nothing to help. Meanwhile, Asha continued her duties with perfect compliance. She spoke only when spoken to, moved through the house like a ghost, performed every task assigned to her without complaint. To anyone observing from the outside, she appeared to be the model of obedience, but Nathaniel could feel her watching him, could sense her presence like a cold spot in every room, could see the faint curve of satisfaction at the corners of her mouth when their eyes met. She was doing nothing overt, nothing that could be proven or punished. She was simply existing, and somehow that existence was killing him. Emmett Boone had stopped coming to the main house entirely, refusing to enter while that witch remained inside. The other slaves gave Asha a wide berth, fear and awe mingling in their gazes. It was on the 14th night after he had struck her that Nathaniel Kane finally broke. He had been lying in bed, staring at the canopy above him, listening to Catherine's peaceful breathing beside him, when he heard the sound, singing, low and melodic, in a language he did not recognize, coming from somewhere deep within the house. The voice was unmistakably Asha's, though he had never heard her sing before. The melody was haunting, ancient, carrying with it the weight of centuries, a song that might have been sung in villages across an ocean, in chains below the decks of ships, in fields under the burning sun, in the quiet moments before death. It wrapped around him like smoke, filling his lungs, making it impossible to breathe. He rose from the bed, moving as if in a trance, and followed the sound. Through the hallway, down the stairs, past the portraits of his ancestors who now seemed to watch him with judgment rather than pride. The singing grew louder, pulling him forward, until he found himself standing outside the door to the parlor. The door was open. Inside, lit only by moonlight streaming through the tall windows, Asha stood in the center of the room, but she was not alone. Surrounding her, forming a circle, were figures, translucent, shimmering, barely visible but undeniably present. The slaves who had died at Blackthorn, dozens of them, men, women, children, all standing in silent witness. And in Asha's hands she held something that made Nathaniel's blood freeze, his father's pocket watch, the one he kept locked in his desk drawer, the one that had been passed down through 3 generations of Kane men. She held it up to the moonlight, and the singing stopped. In the sudden silence she spoke, her voice clear and terrible. "Your father built this empire on bones, your grandfather before him, and you continued the tradition, thinking yourself a king, thinking yourself untouchable. But every kingdom built on suffering must fall, every throne built on corpses must crumble. And every man who profits from the breaking of others must himself be broken." She opened the watch. Inside was not the mechanism of gears and springs, but something else, something dark and wet, something that looked like blood. Nathaniel wanted to run. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to turn and flee, to escape the house, to ride until dawn and never return, but his legs would not obey. He stood frozen in the doorway, watching as Asha closed the watch and let it fall to the floor. It hit the polished wood with a sound like a heartbeat stopping. The figures surrounding her began to move, stepping closer, their translucent forms solidifying with each step until he could see their faces clearly, every scar, every mark of violence, every expression of pain that had been their last. They reached out toward him, their fingers like ice, and Nathaniel finally found his voice. He screamed. The sound tore from his throat raw and primal, the scream of a man confronting the full weight of his sins. Catherine came running, her nightgown flowing behind her, a lamp in her trembling hand. She found her husband collapsed in the doorway of the parlor, convulsing, his eyes rolled back, foam at his lips. The room was empty except for him. No Asha, no figures, no watch on the floor, just empty space and moonlight. "Get the doctor!" Catherine shrieked to the house slaves who had come running at the sound of Nathaniel's scream. "Get Dr. Whitmore now." They carried Nathaniel to his bed, where he thrashed and muttered incoherently, speaking in fragments about ghosts and blood and watches and women with eyes like graves. Dr. Whitmore came within the hour. examined him thoroughly, and diagnosed a complete nervous collapse. His mind has broken under some tremendous strain, the doctor explained to Catherine, who sat weeping at her husband's bedside. I've seen it before in men who've endured great trauma or carried unbearable guilt. He needs rest, quiet, and constant supervision. With time, he may recover. Or... The doctor did not finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. Upstairs in her small room, Asha sat on her thin mattress, adding a fourth item to her collection: a single cufflink, gold and monogrammed, that had belonged to Nathaniel Kane. She wrapped it carefully in the cloth with the others and returned the bundle to its hiding place. Nathaniel Kane died 3 weeks later, never having regained his sanity. He spent his final days screaming about ghosts, clawing at invisible chains, begging forgiveness from people who were long dead. Catherine, overwhelmed and terrified, sold Blackthorn Plantation within 2 months of his death, moving back to her family in Virginia and never speaking of her time there again. The new owner, a banker from Atlanta who knew nothing of the plantation's history, freed all the slaves within a year, not out of moral conviction, but because he found the property unsettling and the venture unprofitable. Emmett Boone disappeared one night and was found a week later in the woods, his body twisted in a position that suggested he had been running from something. The coroner ruled it a heart attack, though he could not explain the expression of absolute terror frozen on Boone's face. Asha was never seen again after the day of the emancipation. Some said she simply walked away, heading north like so many others seeking freedom. But old Martha, who lived another 10 years and told stories until her final breath, said something different. She said that Asha had never been trying to escape. She said that Asha had been sent, called forth by the collective grief and rage of every soul that had suffered at Blackthorn, given form and purpose to do what the living could not. And when her purpose was complete, she simply returned to wherever such spirits wait between one reckoning and the next. The story of Blackthorn Plantation became a legend whispered among the formerly enslaved and their descendants. They spoke of a woman who could call death, who carried justice in her eyes, who proved that even in the darkest times, the universe keeps its own accounts. They said her name like a prayer, Asha, the one who came when she was needed, the one who buried the wicked and freed the innocent, the one who reminded the world that some souls are not born to be broken, but to do the breaking. And in the ruins of Blackthorn, where nothing would grow for 50 years, they said you could still hear her singing on certain nights, that ancient melody, that song of reckoning, echoing across the fields like a promise that justice, however delayed, will always find its way home.